China also played the game uh, by standing resolute till the very end. And President Trump, I think, backed off by saying a few days ago that 145% was too high and nobody could buy anything if that tariff was applied. So he hinted that it would come down, and he in fact gave a figure also of 80%. So, from the initial negotiating position of 145%, he himself came down to 80%.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. My guest is Jayant Dasgupta, India's former ambassador to the World Trade Organization and a specialist in trade issues. Ambassador Dasgupta, welcome. Glad to have you.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. Later.
We are going to try and break down the US China trade deal, or the trade truce as it's been called. It's valid for 90 days, and during that period, negotiations are ongoing on a range of issues. And assuming the negotiations go off well, we assume the full details of the agreement will come out. If they don't, then well, we expect the 90-day truce to continue. Ambassador Dasgupta, how do you see this trade truce or trade deal? Um, I mean, looking at it in terms of the fact that it appears to have been sorted out in just 2 days.
Yes, sir.
There are many facets to this agreement which has been arrived at for the next 20 days. The first thing I wanted to mention is that President Trump was, I think, he was too impulsive when he raised the tariffs to 145%.
Yeah.
And going by the past experience that he has had with China in his
Yeah.
first stint of 2016 to 20, he ought to have exercised more discretion and approached it in a more balanced way. Having said that, China also played the game uh, by standing resolute till the very end. And President Trump, I think, backed off by saying a few days ago that 145% was too high and nobody could buy anything if that tariff was applied. So he hinted that it would come down, and he in fact gave a figure also of 80%. So, from the initial negotiating position of 145%, he himself came down to 80%. Now, what has happened is that the US has reduced its tariffs by 115% from 145 to 30, and so has China from 125 to 10%. So that is, I think, a kind of reciprocity which has been exhibited by both sides. The most important point is that if you look at global trade these days, approximately 50% or slightly over 50% of global trade has some component of electronics
Yeah.
associated with it or embedded in it. You know, if you buy a car, it has a whole lot of electronics.
Yeah.
If you buy even a table lamp, it has electronics in it. You know, the ordinary table lamps that we use in India, they can be, the intensity can be reduced, to 2 notches. So that's all electronics. So everything these days, a fan, an ordinary ceiling fan, has a remote control which has electronics. Now, all these things, China has a huge presence in the global market in making the components as well as the finished products. The other thing which is related to electronics is computer hardware. Whether it is Lenovo or other products which sell under different brand names, a lot of these components are made in China, whether they are made by investors from Taiwan or Korea or Japan. They are the bulk of the output is in China. So if you have to, and mind you, these days, everybody, including me, I'm using a pair of earphones. So all these things are dependent on China and the US because of the adoption of technology by the common man there uses a lot of electronics. So if you charge electronics at 145%, it is going to just make the budget completely unbalanced and cause a lot of uh, resentment and dissatisfaction amongst the ordinary people. The other point I wanted to make is that uh, in uh, mobile phones, which I'm discussing separately, Apple used to have almost all its production facility, which uh, you know it had based on about 300 odd suppliers. Most of these suppliers were in China, and
Yeah.
Apple was assembling its uh, phones, iPads, iPods, etc. in China. Because of the first Trump administration and the assessment that Apple made, Apple decided to have this China plus one. So it chose, of course, Vietnam is there, but it chose India. And in the recent past, it has mentioned that it could export all the iPhones that the Americans buy from India because it is scaling up its production. Of course, one of the problems is that in some of the models, the value of Chinese components goes up to almost 85%. In some of them, it's come down to about 60% of local content and value addition and 40% Chinese content. So I'm sorry, it is the other way around. 60% value addition from China and 40% local. So the problem would have then arisen if the Americans buy Apple phones, then they will have to go behind the veil and find out how much value addition has taken place in which country, a country of origin certificate, and that would have been a nightmare. It just can't be solved because
So,
because of the supply chain issue which has arisen, and it is now a thing which everybody acknowledges in the past 15 or 20 years.
yeah.
So this nightmare would have been there, and mind you, the upper middle class and the more affluent people, especially the younger generation, they keep changing their mobile phones every year or 2 years. So
Yeah.
there is a huge demand. So all
So,
these things put together, the
yeah.
Americans decided to backtrack, or the Trump administration decided to backtrack to lower its rhetoric and to treat China with the respect that it was uh, always claiming that the US was not showing in this uh, you know episode.
Yeah.
So
So,
that is how I think this agreement has been arrived at.
yeah. So what you're telling me is that China is back in business, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but this 30% is still very high. So,
Hmm.
the expectation is that the 30 would come down, and China would also come down from 10% to maybe 5% or something, which is lower than its MFN tariffs, and provide a much better market access to the US than it does to the rest of the world, apart from its FTA partners. And China, in turn, would expect something in the region of 10% or so.
Yeah.
So, uh, but it could be a kind of a graded response, in the sense that textiles, clothing, footwear, other consumer products which the vast majority of Americans consume, they would perhaps be at a lower tariff level. And things which are high tech, which are mainly bought by the large corporations or other producers who use them as intermediate products, they would perhaps have a differential tariff which is higher. So this is the expectation, but I am only making a conjecture because this 30% is unsustainable. It just can't
So,
be kept on like this.
so, what you're telling me is that this whole effort towards diversifying supply chains away from China, where does that stand now?
The problem is that if you look at the product basket which China has, very wide and diverse,
Yeah,
it
diversified.
just
Yeah,
can't be matched by other countries. To a certain extent, aided by China and because of its proximity geographically and otherwise, and its very open policies which it has followed, Vietnam has risen in terms of its position in the exporting arena. So it can substitute for China to a very small extent. Not, its exports only are about $400 billion. I think it's like
yeah,
that. So whereas China's is around, between 3.5 to $4 trillion. So Vietnam can't substitute for China, and you know President Trump has already spent about 4 months of his tenure. So he has about 3 years and 8 months left. And
hmm,
in the last 6 months or so, he will be a lame duck president unless
absolutely.
he carries out his threat that he will have a third term by amending the constitution or whatever. So investments, if they are to take place to replace part of the production which China has now and provide an alternative source of supply to the US, that is going to take at least 3 4 years. And who
Yeah,
would like to, make a guess and invest in a facility which may become infructuous because the tariffs may again come down after
yeah,
Trump leaves. So
yeah.
investments, of course, President Trump was in Saudi Arabia, I think, yesterday, and he said that he's got promises of about $600 billion of investment, which is quite a bit. But other parts of the world are not promising investments in the US.
Yeah,
So China's preeminent position as the manufacturer of the world, I think, remains.
remains.
I forgot to mention one other thing. The US is a net importer of pharmaceuticals. And of course, India has a very strong position in terms of exports to the US. The Chinese are the main suppliers to the US. India, of course, supplies generics and formulations. The
Yeah,
Chinese supply APIs, which are the basic building blocks of medicines. So, and the US just can't, a new facility, if it were to be set up anywhere in the world,
yeah,
it would take between 3 to 5 years. It would need all kinds of clearances by the Food and Drug Administration of the US. And mind you, at this juncture, the number of FDA approved facilities for making medicines in the world are the maximum in India, more so than even in the US. A facility, of course, may have a different capacity, but if you put all of them together, FDA approved facility, India has the maximum number. And India also is dependent to a great extent on Chinese APIs.
yeah,
So this pharmaceuticals, would have been a major problem for the US. Of course, President Trump has been saying that people will come in, and now he's, I think, yesterday or the day before, he was mentioning that prices will be slashed of pharmaceuticals in the US by up to 90%. At the minimum, very minimum, 60%. So it would be an interesting phase of his, uh, actions and his rhetoric, and to see where it ultimately rests the matter.
What about the impact on India? We've been
Yes,
hoping and banking on this entire, diversification away from China, and now it seems to be falling apart.
I think it has to be taken up, uh, in under two different heads. One of them is that, you know, if these tariffs, prohibitive tariffs, were to be continued, Chinese economy would have suffered greatly, but China has deep pockets. So, some of the more obsolete or older factories may have shut down, but they would have ensured that their production levels were still almost at the pre-Trump tariff levels somehow.
Yeah.
So that would have then led to circumvention of these FTAs. For instance, India has an FTA with ASEAN, one with Australia, separate one with Singapore, with Malaysia, with Thailand. Now, all these would have been used to, that is an apprehension that India had, to circumvent and dump. You know, you use these FTAs, so sometimes you can send them across at zero tariffs or 5% tariffs or very low tariffs against the MFN tariff which India imposes on products of, let's say, 10%, 7.5%. So that dumping by China of the excess that it could have. Steel, for instance, the Chinese have a capacity of about 1.5 billion tons of steel, but they only produce about 800 million tons.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 1.5 billion tons. Yeah. Uh, so I think that uh, could have, you know, the other thing is that India, of course, is now the second largest producer of steel at about 1.6, 160 million tons. Now, China has already started diverting part of its production to, India through various countries, even directly. And
Yeah.
India has been forced to take trade defense measures because of that. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is that India was looking forward to occupying part of the space about to be vacated by China.
Yeah.
And that, I think in the 90-day period, that may not take. So that is the second point. And one related point in this regard is that the bilateral trade agreement that India is negotiating with the US, it
Yeah.
also factored in the space to be vacated by China and to be occupied by India, and the offers by the US to allow access, easier access
Yeah.
to India, than the 10% that India is paying at the moment. So that calculation will have to be reworked again. So
So
these three
when we
ways,
are
I think, will get affected.
yeah, so when we are negotiating the FTA with the US, these things we need to keep in mind, because but we don't really know the shape of the US China thing as yet, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
It's
So
negotiating in a bit of vacuum, and
yeah,
in a world of uncertainty. You don't know what you are going to ask for, whether that the premises on which you have based your demands are still going to be valid after 90 days. And one related aspect is that if some countries at least were thinking of making this China plus one, and thinking of investing in India, they would also put
yeah,
this on hold for the time being, to see if the US is going to reduce its tariffs very significantly from 30%.
yeah,
So the incentive to invest in India with its problems, mostly structural and logistics, etc., that may take a back seat. So investment-wise, also India may suffer if theoretically that 145% tariffs had been maintained.
So the commerce minister is now heading for the US. What does he go with? What is his brief now?
It is a very difficult task because the US is, not offering any reductions in tariffs from its
Yeah.
MFN levels or those which it is obliged under the WTO rules to offer to all WTO members. So it is much higher. 10% is much higher than its WTO obligations. Uh, you know, dictate that it should have its tariffs at low levels. That is one. Two, even if India were to offer to reduce, as it seems to have from the reports emanating from Washington, offered certain things, the US can't offer anything because it doesn't have at the moment a trade promotion authority or fast track authority to negotiate trade deals in which there can be a give and take and reduction in tariffs from the existing levels, not the 10% which Trump has imposed, but from the
Yeah.
existing levels of 3.8% down to zero, etc. So, an FTA has to be a give and take process in which
Yeah.
certain things are taken and certain are given, and on a reciprocal basis to make it a win-win situation. So that is something which India will have to think about. That he will only, maybe 20, from 26%, he will come down to 15, 10, whatever, but it will still be much higher.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Congress also, if he continues to maintain high tariffs on a large number of countries which export a bulk of the products that the Americans consume, the US Congress has delegated this power to raise tariffs only in the case of a national emergency. And they already are having a rethink on this issue, whether this delegation needs to be changed, that everything will have to come to the US Congress for approval, even if you raise the tariffs. As far as reduction in tariffs is concerned, it just can't be done by executive order. Reduction meaning from the MFN levels promised at the government.
So last question, what are India's options at this point? Do we again start raising barriers? What do we do?
I think one has to be pragmatic. So we can offer uh, reduction in tariffs on a range of products in which the US is not really very competitive globally. But having said that, the US's interest in exporting those products may also not be very deep rooted. So, for instance, Harley Davidson, we have already reduced tariffs. Even if we reduce the tariffs to low levels, let's say 10% or 5%,
Yeah.
how many Harley Davidson motorcycles of 800 cc and above can be sold in India? In any case, Harley Davidson is reported to have entered into an agreement with Hero Motors in
Yeah.
India to make 400 cc motorcycles. So the issue is that the US would like us to reduce tariffs across the board so we can offer tariff reductions on a host of products in which the US is not competitive. But the problem lies in some agricultural products like soyabean, corn, like poultry, like dairy products, especially on issues like the GM. Corn and
Yeah.
soya are produced using GM, and the poultry products and the dairy products, the cattle there, milch cattle, are fed with the entrails of animals.
Yeah.
So are the poultry, the chicken. They are also reared on pig entrails and other things. Now,
Yeah.
everything will have to be certified, a sanitary certificate, as they say. So, will have to be given because it can cause major problems in India in
Yeah.
terms of the religious sensitivities. So, it is not an easy thing, and mind you, the poultry sector in India, we have one or two very large hatcheries, which have
Yeah.
lakhs of birds, but it is mainly in the small scale sector, and dairy especially. You don't have a dairy with 2,000 milch cattle. You have small farmers contributing, their daily produce, and being part of a cooperative which has spread all over the country now. So it is going to be difficult because it's also a livelihood issue.
Yeah.
Even farmers, even producers, milk producers, many of them do not own any land. They are living in the rural areas. They are doing other things, allied activities, and also rearing cattle to supplement their incomes. So it is going to be a major issue in lowering the tariffs on milk products, and in reducing the demand for sanitary certificates, and on the other side about the GM issue.
So, final question. Do you see us now slowing down this entire push for FTAs
From the side of India, or
from India's side? Yes.
it was, I think, labeled a bilateral trade agreement, but there was very
Yeah.
little bilateral engagement in that. It was all unilateral. The US was only demanding and going to take. So if we can get something, and if we can get the tariffs reduced to below 10%, back to the MFN levels, with concessions, of course, from our side, that itself would be a very big, I think, achievement under the circumstances.
Okay. On that note, Ambassador Dasgupta, thank you for that perspective. Clearly, there are very, very rough days ahead. Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.